if you look at, for example, the Buddhist path is famously known as the Noble Eightfold Path, the Arya Ashtanga Marga. The Noble Eightfold Path is sort of the literal translation. But the same word Ashtanga that you see in Ashtanga Yoga, right? Which is a misnamed modern physical yoga. Arya Ashtanga Marga, the Noble Eightfold Path of the Buddha. Now, as it happens, the Buddha only invented one of the 8 limbs of his Eightfold Path. He organized material that was around at his time. But I just mention it because the first limb, or the first component of the Noble Eightfold Path, is called Samyak Drishti, right view. Right view. Now, what does that mean? Right view. It means that before you really get into the serious spiritual sadhana, you get oriented to the view on the nature of reality according to that tradition. Now, I mention Buddhism just because most people know Buddhism, but in fact, it's the same for every traditional Asian spiritual path. As you probably know, all the Asian spiritual paths, all the spiritual paths in Asia in the pre-modern era, all of them derive from India, which was disproportionately influential to the region historically. So all the Asian spiritual paths start with the cultivation of right view. So what does that mean? That you, again, get oriented to the worldview or the philosophy of the tradition for multiple reasons. One, so you can see if this resonates with you at all, and whether the goal described by the tradition is one which calls to you. Of course, we could say that, potentially all paths, any path could lead to enlightenment, to awakening and liberation, but there are many different flavors of awakening, and some paths can take you further than others, and some help you actualize a different flavor of awakening. Sometimes there's crossover, the whole thing's unpredictable, but still, each tradition describes the goal of the path within its view teachings, the teachings of on the view. Okay, drishti or darshana means view. So that's important to know, that you're interested in the goal of the path you're considering walking on. And then you also, in view teachings, get inspiration, right? You get all this lovely inspiration, beautiful spiritual teachings and philosophy and everything, right? But ultimately speaking, all the philosophy, all the stuff that can be understood with the mind is, in a way, the bait on the hook, right? If the fisherman is the Buddha or Abhinavagupta or whoever, the view teachings are the bait on the hook. And that's all they are, ultimately, because you cannot think your way to enlightenment. You cannot merely, cultivate understanding of the teachings and through believing in the teachings fervently attain something, right? So that is different. Please note how different it is from Western traditions, where you are saved through your belief. Not in all Western traditions, right? But in Protestant Christianity, you are saved by fervently believing that Jesus Christ is the one and only Son of God and he died for your sins. In Islam, you are saved by believing that Muhammad is the infallible prophet of God and the seal of the prophets, and so on. In these traditions, in these Asian traditions, you are not saved by believing anything. You are not redeemed. You are not freed from suffering, but it could seem like you are. Because if you believe the spiritual teachings, that can bring about a change in your experience to some extent. If you go around believing life sucks, everything's horrible, there's no purpose or meaning to anything, there's no pattern, humans are intrinsically terrible. And then you come to believe the opposite of those statements, right? You will have an improved experience of life. But that's far from awakening still, because what's happened then is that you have refined your mind. You've made your mind into a better mind. And as the tradition says, you're just dreaming a better dream, but you're still dreaming. You've not woken up. So as soon as we get, adequately oriented to the view, right? As soon as we're inspired and we understand the goal as well as the mind can, which is really not very well at all, but we're inspired, we more or less sort of get the goal, and the mind is satisfied. Now, this takes more work for some of us than others, because some of us are more kind of intellectual, I guess, more concerned with coherence and comprehensibility and all this stuff. So the mind needs to be satisfied. And when it's satisfied, it settles down and gets out of the way of sadhana. So you satisfy yourself. Maybe you're the sort of person that could never be completely satisfied, right? But the mind can be more or less satisfied. Oh, this is a philosophy that makes sense. This is in accord with my values. This is intuitively speaking to me. This is giving words to what I always suspected might be the case and felt and hoped was the case. All of that, right? The mind feels satisfied, and then it can get out of the way of sadhana, the spiritual practice. But the mind keeps wanting to be involved. It's only properly involved in step 1, cultivation of view. But it wants to keep being involved all the time because it thinks it is the self. The mind thinks it is the self. And this delusion generates, tremendous suffering, even when you don't realize that that's the source of your suffering. Okay? So, once we get into sadhana proper, and I feel I have not emphasized this enough for all of you guys, and it must be emphasized because many of you come to these teachings because you read Tantra Illuminated, you read the Recognition Sutras, and so you are, by and large, well-educated, smart, intelligent people. Some of you might say, "Oh, I don't think I'm intelligent," or whatever. But still, if you read that book or even part of that book, Tantra Illuminated or Recognition Sutras, and didn't just put it down and say, well, that's just a bunch of words, then you're smarter than you think. But your very intelligence is a handicap, right? As I learned all too well in my journey, right? So the point is, and I'm going to try to explain this, and this is hard to do because the mind is what's hearing these words. Well, actually, not that simple, because essence nature is hearing these words, but the mind responds, right? The mind reacts. It formulates a response or a reaction, even though, of course, essence nature pervades everything that's going on and hears these words as well, right? So the mind stands ready to co-opt anything at any moment, and it does it well, and it does it fast. So you start practicing and you have a bit of an experience, and the mind goes, I'm having an experience. I think it means this, or what does it mean? And it is ready to just run away with the experience before you've had a chance to even have it, right? As soon as you are believing thought, involved with thought, evaluating thought, struggling with thought, the mind is in control. It's in control from the very first moment that you turn your attention to ask, is this thought true? And that's why on the path, we stress the teaching, no thoughts are true. Even though it is the case that some thoughts are truer than others. Wait, if no thoughts are true, how can some thoughts be truer than others? Because some are more effective pointers than others, but no thought is in fact true. And that's such an important teaching, because otherwise you get caught up so easily in evaluating, what's the truth value of this thought? Hang on, I have to stop this alarm that you probably don't even hear. So the experience gets co-opted by the mind, and before you know it, you can't experience the experience because you're already in a mental concept of it. Wordless insight arises and gets clothed in thought. And then before you know it, you're focused on the thought form, the thought representation of the wordless insight, and therefore you're not in touch with the insight itself. Wordless insight is fungible, right? It can inflect in countless different ways in countless different contexts, whereas an insight translated into thought can only be relevant in a specific context, because that's the nature of language. Language is inherently dualistic and exclusionary. So as soon as you translate the wordless insight into thought, it's then only relevant to the context usually in which you did the translation, right? And you lose touch with the fungible wordless insight that could theoretically be inflected in many different ways if you're still in touch with it. It can serve in many different contexts. Okay. Now, so when you hear, once you've learned the view, once you've said, I'm on this path, right? Now, some people are concerned about, committing to a path. They kind of think of it like committing to marriage or something. How do I know this is the right person? And how do I know this is the right path? And in a way, that's missing the point, because they're ultimately speaking, if we leave aside just false and fraudulent paths, there is only one spiritual path in many different costumes. So you choose a path not because it's intrinsically different from any other path that works. Note, that works. It's not intrinsically different from any other path that works. You're choosing it because it's a good fit. Just like theoretically speaking, loving any one person, anyone, could open you to the experience of universal love. Loving any one person on earth deeply and unconditionally could open you and will open you to the experience of universal love for all beings and as all beings, the universal infinite love that is your deepest nature, it's part of your deepest nature. But still, you exercise discernment about who you partner with because you want a good fit. You don't only want to have the opportunity to open to access the universal love, right? So the spiritual path is indeed the same way. So you choose it and you have immersed in the view, and then you need to change your relationship to the teachings, where the teachings are once you've accepted the path, the teachings are no longer they're no longer propositions to be evaluated. They are now pointers to possibilities within your direct experience. They are pointers to what you can experience for yourself. Okay, so That's a very different thing. They're no longer propositions to be evaluated and thought about. They're pointers to what you could experience. So once you're in this phase, you must leave aside any teaching that, for now, leave aside any teaching that you can't see where it's pointing. But people being sort of over intellectualized, they want to understand all the teachings, and I don't get this one. Let me try to think about it a lot. No. Once you're in the real practice phase, each teaching is a pointer, and if you can't see where it's pointing, lay it aside and maybe pick it up again later and see if you can see where it's pointing then, right? So either a teaching is pointing out something in direct experience, or it arose from a kind of experience that you haven't yet had. So you can ask the question in one of two ways. It ultimately boils down to the same thing, but you can ask the question one of two ways. What is this teaching pointing to in my direct experience? Or what sort of experience of reality would have caused someone to say this in the first place? Right? So any religion could become a mystical path. For example, if Christians were to ask themselves, what must Jesus have been experiencing in his moment-to-moment reality to make the statements that he made, just assuming the statements in the Bible are really from Jesus, and it's actually not clear for many of them. But anyway, let's just assume, Sermon on the Mount or whatever is really spoken by Jesus. But now you're looking at it in a different way. It's not prophecy, it's not belief, it's not philosophy, it's not propositions to be evaluated. It's the expression of the direct experience of Yeshua Bar Yosef, better known as Jesus. What kind of experience would have caused him to speak in this way? So when you're inquiring into where it arose from, now this is valid. It's not valid in some Western traditions, but it's valid in these Asian traditions because they all teach, or almost all teach, the principle of macrocosm, microcosm. Everything that exists in the universe of human experience exists as a potentiality within you. Therefore, whatever the Buddha experienced, whatever Jesus experienced, is at least in some measure accessible to you. Might not be easily accessible, might be very subtle, might take some time, might not become your constant experience, but it's there within you. Right? So you see the two questions, they're kind of the same question, but traveling along different vectors. What is the teaching pointing to in my direct experience? Or where did this teaching arise from? What would have caused someone to speak in this way? But you see, when you try to answer that question, it doesn't work to think about it. There's no point. You have to feel into what direct experience, what non-conceptual experience would have caused someone to speak in this way. And it's not that you can answer that for sure, but you're feeling into it. Okay? So then through this relentless practice of looking where the teachings point in direct experience, sooner or later, there's what we call awakening, right? Which, as many of you know, is a paradigm shift. It's not an experience. It's a paradigm shift. And I'll just, a little bit of repetition here, but it's really important to get this super solid, that the paradigm shift may be accompanied by dramatic experience or less dramatic experience or almost zero experience, depending on the constitution of the person, of the body-mind undergoing this perspectival shift. but it's the shift that matters. And the shift is not an experience, it's a change in the context of experience. It's a change in the way that you experience everything you experience. Okay? So it may be accompanied by phenomenological bells and whistles, you know, choirs of angels, exploding lights, serpentine energy running up and down my spine, the hair on my body standing on end, tears rolling down my cheeks. You know, the list goes on. And in our culture that fetishizes peak experiences, this then grabs your attention. The experience grabs your attention, and then the mind tries to make something out of it as soon as it possibly can. You know, maybe I'm one of the special chosen ones. Maybe the ascended masters have chosen me for a sacred mission on earth, or other less dramatic versions of the same sort of delusion, right? So when the mind co-opts experience, it often makes a self out of it. So it forms a self-image. What kind of person must I be to be having this experience, right? That's just a way of co-opting experience that is self-referential, right? But even if you don't make a self out of it, if the mind co-opts the experience, what does this mean? You know, what does this indicate about the nature of reality? Then you're already in the mind, and the mind is endlessly self-reflective. The mind doesn't access the deeper nature of reality, it merely reflects it. And that's a big difference. It's an important difference, right? So the mind is like funhouse mirrors, like a hall of mirrors, and they're all reflecting each other, right? And it seems to have great depth, like when you have the two mirrors facing each other, and it seems to go to infinity. The mind seems to have great depth when it has actually very, very little depth. It's just a lot of reflections bouncing around. And so it seems more complex and interesting than it really is. Okay, so once this paradigm shift we call awakening happens, right, it can stabilize or not stabilize. Okay, you're seeing things in a new way, and that stabilizes or it doesn't yet. Okay, it will sooner or later. Don't worry about it. You know, there's this phenomenon called I got it, I lost it. And it's not real. You can never lose anything. It's just that, you know, the power of your undigested experiences, the power of your samskaras is for most people great enough that it pulls you back into the habitual way of seeing things again and again, right? But that itself is part of the process. It's not that you could really lose something. When you get pulled back into your habitual way of seeing things, it is in fact the case that those samskaras, those unresolved experiences in your system, are calling out for resolution. They're saying, attend to me because I need resolution over here. So it's not wrong. Because you see how weird the mind is. Like it's going to conceptualize it like, oh, I failed. I had the awakened vision, and now I'm just back in my shit, you know, as if something's gone wrong. That's madness. Only the mind could think something has gone wrong, right? The samskaras are calling for attention and resolution. Okay, sooner or later, the paradigm shift stabilizes. Now, of course, it can be the case that the paradigm shift can happen so forcibly, so powerfully for someone that it stabilizes of its own accord. And there's not this back and forth. That could be back and forth for years, right? My friend and former student Jeremy was here at the center recently. Oh, it's just so wonderful to hear his story. You know, he went back and forth for 10 years, maybe, between selfless non-dual awareness or presence, and being just a guy. Right? On one level, we're all just a guy or gal, but you know what I mean. Identified with his limited individuality versus not being, back and forth, and then finally it stabilized, right? And he says the experience is, almost constant pure presence. And for other people, it can just stabilize much more rapidly of its own accord. So, Isabella, I'll come to you in a little bit here. And whoever else, Amba. Now, you might imagine, oh, okay, for the person for whom it stabilizes this paradigm shift, oh, does that mean they don't have to digest any sanskaras? No, it doesn't mean that, in fact, because if it's not the case that you need to digest samskaras to stabilize, it is the case that you need to digest samskaras in order to deepen the awakening. I don't know if deepen's quite the right word, but a thing happens, and certainly happened to me, where with undigested samskaras, the awakening forms into a very subtle concept. And this is really hard to catch because it's not actually thought. It's not at all going around thinking, I'm awakened. Wow, this is, I'm a awake guy now. No, it's a non-verbal, subtle concept of awakening that is keeping you sort of homogenous, keeping you coasting, keeping you plateaued. And it's a very pleasant plateau. It's a lovely plateau. The view is wonderful. It's balmy weather, everything. But it's not, it's a kind of stagnancy, or it becomes a stagnancy sooner or later. And this is what happens so that you can avoid. It's an attempt, subconsciously, we could say, to avoid going into what people call the shadow. Okay, I'll clarify that in a moment. But by the way, there's not really literally such thing as subconscious. It's just a figure of speech. But it's as if, you form this subtle concept of awakening and dwell in that concept, even after you've had the awakening, I mean, in order to avoid the so-called shadow work, right? I don't love this phrase, as some of you know, but without any concept, without any psychology involved necessarily, if you open to it, there's all this stuff that comes up to be witnessed and digested. Not just witnessed, actually, experienced. Right? Now, the real shadow work, whatever we want to call it, post-awakening is quite different. Because again, it doesn't involve conceptualization. Whereas if you go to a psychologist, right, a psychotherapist, it's using the mind to help make a healthier mind. The mind is working on making itself healthier. And can be a difficult process, or wonderful, but it doesn't matter. But the point is, in the post-awakening shadow work, you're not using the mind at all. You're just opening to what needs to be experienced and resolved by being seen in the light of awake awareness, which includes unconditional loving presence. Now, what is surprising, I was just listening to Angelo talk about this a bit, and on this point, I agree with him a lot. What's surprising, once you've had the awakening shift, you think, like, the shift is so powerful for many people that you think, oh, this is just, life is peaches and cream from now on, surely. because like I see the nature of reality. I am the nature of reality. I see what all the bullshit that, the human bullshit for what it is. But then, surprisingly and shockingly to some, it's like you need to experience all that is within you, and what's within you is a fuckload, right? Because you need to experience all that was not allowed by your persona, especially your spiritual persona, right? So Angelo gives the examples of you're going to need to experience absolutely intense, raw, white hot hatred. And if you experience that, you're going to be like, well, doesn't seem like the spiritual path. Hatred is not spiritual, but it's within you. And it's been separated off. Everything is within you, right? It doesn't matter if you've successfully suppressed it. You think, I've never had a hateful feeling in my life. Okay, that just means you're good at suppression. But it all that has been separated off and denied, from sexuality to rage, anger, hatred, sorrow, grief, etc., all of that needs to be experienced in this raw state. Now, this is even more intense than it sounds, because post-awakening shift, you feel everything more fully, like times 10 or 100 or 1,000, depending on the moment, right? So it's amazing, right? And it's painful. And you have to keep feeling everything fully until you are thoroughly checkmated, meaning you have no hope of escape. You can't outwit it. You can't figure it out. You can't manage it. You can't control it. You can't handle it. How do I handle what's coming up? You don't. How do I handle it is just another disguise of how can I control it. Okay. So you need to feel it all. Now, can you do this before the awakening shift? Because this is an important question, because you can't bring about the awakening shift by force of will. Of course, by definition, the illusory separate self cannot make anything significant happen by the force of its personal will, which is itself illusory, right? So you can't force awakening. You have to pray for it, and practice to prepare the ground for it and make that ground more fertile. But you can't make it happen. So do you just have to wait to do this kind of shadow work? No, not necessarily. If you are able to be with embodiment and experience in a non-conceptual way. But this is harder than it sounds, because as soon as you experience something unexpected, as soon as you experience something more intense than you thought it would be, or different than you thought it would be, the mind grabs onto it right away. And in fact, you start to realize, it's much easier to realize this after the awakening shift, but you start to realize, oh my God, the mind is my ultimate defense mechanism. I go into thought to avoid feeling. I go into thought to avoid feeling, to buffer the feeling, to manage the feeling. So the mind has to become disarmed of its strategies. It has to be decentered, right? And that's not necessarily an easy task, but it could be, for some of you, as simple as this. As soon as you go, when you feel something and then boom, you're going into thought, you just ask, what am I avoiding with this thought? What am I avoiding to feel with this thought? And the thought's going to be captivating if it's especially brilliant intelligent or especially grotesque and horrible, the mind will do anything to get your attention. Anything. Anything. So if you give it an inch, it takes a mile. As soon as you're struggling with the mind, it's already won. As soon as you're struggling with the mind, it's already won. Don't struggle. Just bring your attention back to visceral experience, the senses, the body, and what is felt. Now, if you don't have, for example, emotional vocabulary, you need to develop that before you go beyond it. Just like if you don't have some semblance of a healthy ego, you probably, depends on the person, but you'll probably need to develop some version of a healthy ego before you go beyond ego, right? So we endorse helping children and teenagers learn about their emotions and helping adults that never had an emotional vocabulary, which is 85% of the population, to develop that emotional vocabulary, okay? But then you go beyond it because you realize to even give one word is already a story. To call what I'm feeling anger or whatever else, it's already a story. And it doesn't help. As soon as you think you know what it is, then you're going to think about it. Why is this anger? Is it justified? Blah, 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 blah. As soon as you're trying to figure it out, the mind has already won that battle. Every battle has to end in surrender as soon as possible. As soon as you're trying to figure it out, the mind's already won that battle. Let it go. Come back to the body. Come back to the sensation. Come back to the feeling that you were labeling as this or that, and realize, oh, this is more nuanced, more subtle, more rich and deep than that label could capture. Okay. Now, if the feeling is uncomfortable, then we go even more compulsively into the mind. Whether it's simple or complicated. Simple is like, I just don't feel like doing this anymore. I'm interested in something else now. That's the mind trying to escape the uncomfortable feeling, right? Or it could be complicated, like, oh, I have such a good insight about this experience, right? That's the mind tempting itself into thought through its own imagined brilliance.